Hi, it's the 2nd of April. I'm Geoff Garrett, and I'm here today with Katherine Milkman, who delivered a fantastic presentation on behaviour change yesterday in our epidemics class. And the first question I wanted to ask you, Katie, is, you've been living in this world of behaviour change for a long time, thinking about how to help people commit to their fitness regimes, to stay in, use gym memberships, etc. What's different or what's the same between the kind of environment you're normally thinking about and this extraordinary one we have today with the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one thing that came up in class that I think is a really good point is that anxiety and stress are elevated in this environment. So we have to think about how all of the things we normally teach and understand about the way people make decisions might shift under stress, under anxiety, under scarcity situations. And so actually what we know about behavior is that a lot of the things I specialize in studying, which are these mistakes that people tend to make when they're trying to do their best, but things like being too focused on the present as opposed to thinking big picture and focusing on the future and saving enough, exercising enough, things like, which is a mistake. Other mistakes that we make, like worrying too much about, what other people think and not enough about, again, what's best for us globally. A lot of those decision heuristics that we rely on, they actually get amped up when we're in a situation of stress. And so I think that's a really important thing to recognize when we're thinking about how to change behavior, that a lot of the heuristics and biases and mistakes people make are going to be even more common. And we're going to have to design systems that are expecting those mistakes even more often.
Okay, so the behavioural revolution obviously has been a profound thing, really questioning the core rationality assumptions that are at the foundation of modern economics. So let's talk about a few of the big concepts and how they might apply in the pandemic. The first one is framing. And in the context of the pandemic, we have now the president and other members of the task force saying that they don't know how many deaths there are going to be from the pandemic, right? This incredible ghoulish conversation about mortality. And people say we have a low end of maybe 100,000 deaths, a high end in the millions of deaths. This is enormous framing. How do you evaluate how the government is dealing with the framing challenge right now?
It's a great question. I mean, this is a really interesting challenge for many reasons, but framing is a really fascinating part of it because we've known since the late 1970s that when we're talking about the potential for a loss, we behave really differently and react really differently than when we talk about the very same possibility in terms of what we stand to gain. And there's sort of two really important things that change when we talk about losses versus gains. When we talk about losses, we actually tend to be more risk-seeking than when we talk about gains. And also, when we talk about losses, we tend to react more strongly. So we're about twice as unhappy about the idea of a loss as we are happy about the possibility of an equivalent gain. So the way we choose our words, whether we're talking about losses or gains, has this huge impact. And it's interesting because this public dialogue is very focused on all the lives we might lose. And there's been very little discussion of all the lives we might save with different policy decisions. And so that has implications for the way that people listen, the way they behave, the way they hear, and what they do. And so I think it's interesting. I do think that there's wisdom in focusing on the losses to the extent that we're just trying to get people to change their own behavior, in that we're going to hear that loss as twice as powerful a message when we focus on what we might lose than we will if we hear a gain message. But we may also take riskier actions to try to offset losses. So that's the trade-off.
So you think because of that loss aversion kind of that we know from the research, in essence, scaring people is a responsible thing for government leaders to be doing? And I remember it's now 2 weeks ago when Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, came out and said 2/3 of the German population was going to get the coronavirus. That sounded like an astronomical number. And you could say, God, why is she scaring her country like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Is it responsible to scare everyone? I mean, I think you have to weigh the pros and the cons, right? There's a downside because we have to worry about everyone's mental health in a crisis situation. But right now, it seems like the biggest challenge is getting people to stick to these regulations and stay inside and practice proper social distancing and be safe. And in that situation, my guess is that on balance, we're better off using that aggressive tactic that's going to lead people to do what's best for public health, even if it does have this pretty serious, downside of making us all very frightened and stressed out. But yeah, to me, it does seem like this is exactly the kind of situation where you want to frighten people. That is my interpretation.
Okay, so let's move to the next big concept in behavioral economics, which is nudges and nudging people. So you're an expert in opt-in versus opt-out, but at the moment, I think we've sort of got suggestion versus orders. Think about stay at home, for example. Do you think we should be nudging more or ordering more in this current environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. This came up yesterday with the students, this question of do we really need nudges? Because I talked a lot about nudges and all the different tools of choice architecture we can use to try to shift people's decisions at this moment. And I think it's actually a false dichotomy to say, do we need nudges or orders? I actually think we need both. So this is a real crisis. We need to order people to stay inside. We need to order people to take the right actions. But we can layer on top of orders all of the right choice architecture and persuasion messaging that will facilitate actual compliance, right? Because it's not possible to literally lock everyone in their homes. And in fact, some people need to leave their homes and still practice safe distancing while they're leaving. So we need to combine the two toolkits. We need to use everything we have. And also we have some policy challenges that we're facing with, people who are on SNAP benefits, people who need to collect these checks that are going to come out, and we're going to have to make decisions about the best way to deliver those benefits. And that's another opportunity to use choice architecture to design things wisely, to make sure that rather than having people opt in to benefits that are going to save lives, they're defaulted into receiving them, for instance. And we want to use social norms messaging and say, everybody's doing this and staying at home, you should too, as opposed to focusing on the people who are not complying or are hoarding, which is actually going to lead to just the wrong behaviors. Because when we see someone else doing something, we think it's natural that we should do it too. So
let me press you on that one for a second.
Yeah.
So there's positive social contagion, everybody's social distancing, you should too. Mm-hmm. But then there's negative social contagion, the great toilet paper crisis shortage of 2020. So is there anything we know from the behavioral approaches that could reduce hoarding behavior, unhelpful hoarding behavior?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One thing actually is, by the way, just make it really clear that even though it's happening, it's really bad, right? And I think leaders are doing a good job with that, right? Similar with mask buying, which we may see a change in regulations, but we were seeing lots of people buying masks and leaders were saying it's bad. We need to save the few masks we have for public health. So that's called, actually in the research literature, it's called an injunctive norm. Just convey what we want people to be doing, give them, really positive praise when they're doing the right thing, highlight what the right thing is from the social good perspective. And then the second is do not shine a light on these bad behaviors. Because when we highlight that other people are hoarding, it makes you feel like, oh, I should join. I'm going to miss out if I don't. So the less we, shine a light on it, talk about it happening, give it media coverage, the better. And this is something that a lot of media outlets focus on when it comes to, by the way, suicide prevention. There's an understanding that putting news about suicide in the paper actually leads to increased suicide. And journalists are very responsible, actually, about not covering suicide as much as they cover other topics or highlighting it, because there's a recognition that it can lead to more. And we can do the same thing with these negative behaviors. By not shining a light on them, we can actually help reduce their incidence.
Of course, which is very hard for media companies. But just on the masks case, it's now, people are now conjecturing that the government told a quote-unquote white lie that masks wouldn't help, when in fact what they were concerned about was hoarding and therefore shortages. Do you have a view on this? Is a white lie ever justified?
Yeah, well, it creates real challenges with trust, of course, because now we realize that there's a possibility when we're given information, it's not actually the information that's in our best interest, but rather misinformation. So that's going to make it harder for the government to communicate with us and have us believe them in the future. So that's the downside. On the other hand, if it saved lives, you could imagine why people might have argued it was justified at the time, because I've read estimates earlier today that something like 100 times more important for medical workers to have masks than individuals. So you can see why it was done. On the other hand, if I had been involved, my recommendation would have probably been to have a different messaging strategy that actually explained the limited supply, begged people and used good behavioral science tactics to encourage them not to use masks at this time or to hoard masks, to make their own, perhaps, and was more honest about the situation.
Yeah, but of course that honest messaging hasn't worked in the toilet paper case, right? I've read all these stories about the toilet paper supply chain is secure. We've got ample supplies. All that information gets out there and people still act in a panicked way. So I just wonder where health was more concerned, like masks. I mean, the government does seem to have been in an impossible position on this one.
No, I completely agree with you that it's a really tough position. And, if there's a justification for misinformation or for authoritarian tactics, ever, the only one that I could ever see is one that's going to save really large numbers of lives, but it does have these severe consequences. And so again, I think I would have tried a different approach personally, but it's just tough. This is a tough situation.
So my last question is actually going to be one of the last questions that a student raised in your presentation yesterday. Your initiative at Penn with Angela Duckworth is called Behaviour Change for Good. And that's a clever double entendre. So for good, doing things that are in our interest, but also for good, enduring. So what's your assessment right now of how much of the behaviour change that's happening in the crisis will endure? Will we go back to normal, or will some things be permanently changed?
It's a great question, and it is really a fascinating moment, because what we know about how behavior change happens is that these things that cause shifts in our routines can create really enduring change. And when we are exposed to or forced to sample new things, that can create enduring change. So my prediction would be that we will see major lasting shifts in some behaviors, where people are exploring new technologies, for instance, for getting work done and finding that they're sufficient or even better than the way they were doing things before. For instance, I can give you a personal example of something that's going to change in my life. I've discovered the beauty of exercise videos, which is not something I used before to get my workouts in. And I've discovered in my living room I can do great yoga, and it's really fun. So that's something I'm going to keep doing. These things where we're making discoveries, those will stay with us. But things where it's clear that we're just using an inferior substitute right now at home, like watching music online, watching a live streaming concert is nothing like a live concert, right? That is not going to change. People are going to go back to normal when it comes to the things that you just can't substitute with technology. But I do think it'll be really exciting to see what innovations come about, and we will see, I think, major changes in a lot of life patterns thanks to the new ideas this introduced.
Well, thanks a lot for your wisdom, Katie, and for your time, and hope to see you again very soon.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for interviewing me.